Welcome everyone to Anti-Asian Racism, COVID-19, and Becoming an Anti-Racism Ally. My name is Padre Vang, Mission Chair for the Liberal Arts, and I will be facilitating tonight's session. I apologize for the late start tonight. We had some technical difficulties a little bit there, so thanks for hanging in there with us. We are happy to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Jennifer Ho. Let me give a little context for tonight's session before introducing Dr. Ho. The rise of COVID-19 has also seen a rise in violence against Chinese or anyone perceived to be Chinese in the US and globally. This racism is not new. For as long as there have been Asians in America, there has been anti-Asian racism. And history has shown that every instance of conflict with an Asian nation results in anti-Asian xenophobia and hate crimes. For example, attacks on South Asians and Middle Eastern Americans in the aftermath of 9/11. This talk will address the history of racism against Asians in the US, the current xenophobia against Chinese, why saying the phrase Chinese virus or anything other than its official name, COVID-19, is racist, the links between anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism, and what every person can do to educate themselves about racism and become an anti-racism ally and educator. A little bit about Dr. Ho, our speaker tonight. The daughter of a refugee father from China and an immigrant mother from Jamaica. Dr. Jennifer Ho is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies and the director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Dr. Ho received her BA in English from the University of California, Santa Barbara, 1992, and her PhD in English from Boston University in 2003, and had a faculty appointment at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill from 2004 to 2019, where she taught courses in Asian American literature, contemporary multi-ethnic American literature, critical race studies, and intersectionality. Dr. Ho is the author of 3 books, Consumption and Identity in Asian American Coming-of-Age Novels, published by Routledge Press in 2005. Racial Ambiguity in Asian American Culture, published by Rutgers University Press in 2015, which won the South Atlantic Modern Languages Association Award in 2016 for Best Monograph in Understanding Jisgen, published by the University of South Carolina Press in 2015. Dr. Ho is co-editor of a collection of essays on race and narratology, titled Race, Ethnicity, and Narrative in the United States, published by OSU Press in 2017, and a forthcoming series of teaching essays on Asian American literature, titled Teaching Approaches to Asian American Literature. She has published in journals such as Modern Fiction Studies, Journal for Asian American Studies, AmeriAsia Journal, the Global South, and has also presented at conferences such as the International Society for the Study of Narrative, American Studies Association, Modern Language Association, American Literature Association, and the Association of Asian American Studies, where she has just been elected as the incoming president, effective April 2020. 2 of her current book projects are a breast cancer memoir and a family autobiography that will consider Asian Americans in the Global South, the narrative of her maternal family's immigration from Hong Kong to Jamaica to North America. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Ho is active in community engagement and issues of race and intersectionality, leading workshops on anti-racism and how to talk about race in our current political climate. During the session, if you have questions, please place them in the chat box. Dr. Ho will respond to the questions towards the latter half of this session. Now I'll hand it over to Dr. Ho. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And really thank you to the entire St. Catherine University community for spending time with me this evening. I'm going to try and have only a 15 to 20 minute presentation because I'd love to have time for the Q&A. I also want to, before I start, want to really thank Dean Johnson, Dean Stanley, Padre Vang for that lovely introduction, and Dr. Dolan, who I think is the one who recommended me to come to all of you. So yes. Big shout out to Sarah. And let's get started with the slides. So apologies that the formatting seems to be a little off, but that's okay. We're just going to talk through it all. So if anyone is interested in having a copy of this slide deck, feel free to go to my Twitter feed, which is at Dr. Jen Ho. The pinned tweet will lead you to a Google form. Happy to share out the slide deck, and I'll explain about that in a little bit. Dean Johnson also put the link to the CU Boulder website so you can follow along if that's an easier way for you to see the slides. So the first thing is, who am I? You got a really full introduction, so I'm not going to really belabor this. I think that what's important for you to know is that my expertise on this subject comes both from my academic study of critical race theory, Asian American studies, as well as my lived experience being the daughter of a refugee father and an immigrant mother. And I have chosen to always be introduced with those two markers, that I am the daughter of a refugee father and an immigrant mother, after President Trump came to office and the first thing he did was to enact a Muslim ban, or try to enact a Muslim ban. And so I think it's really important when we have these kinds of very deep connections to the things that we're studying to really announce them as much as possible professionally. Okay, so why did I create a slide deck to address anti-Asian racism and COVID-19? So in the early days of the pandemic, before it really hit full force in the United States, a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Jason Oliver Chang, saw what was happening in China and predicted that there was going to be a rise in anti-Asian racism because there has always been a rise in anti-Asian racism when there has been any kind of conflict with an Asian nation. So we've seen this happen from the 19th century through to our present day. So he started to develop a set of resources on an online open syllabus, which is linked into the PowerPoint that I'm going to go through. And so it's also found in the hyperlinks in the website. So in early April, when increasingly I was hearing people talk about the China virus or the Wuhan virus or the more obviously racist Kung flu, I wanted to really address this about how this language is very harmful. So seemingly it seems benign, right? The virus originated in China. What's wrong with saying Chinese virus? I wanted to create a slide deck to help educate people about how saying the phrase Chinese virus was linked into a larger history of anti-Asian racism, of yellow peril rhetoric, and moreover to empower people to become anti-racism allies and educators, which for all of you on this talk, you have taken the first step. Whether you call yourself an anti-racism educator or ally, by being on this talk, you are making a choice that you want to become an anti-racism educator and ally. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so this is the slide deck. So I have broken all of the rules that we as educators use when creating a PowerPoint slide deck. And I did that really deliberately. I created the most bare bones slide deck possible because my intention is for educators to use this, edit these slides, take things out, add things, and make it their own. So while, yes, I've created the content and put in all these hyperlinks, and it would be nice, you know, so as not to plagiarize, that at some point I get mentioned, if you want to copy the slide deck, it is yours, and you can do with it what you want. Okay, so moving on. The first thing I do is I define racism. So again, I don't need to say this to all of you, what racism is, but for the many different audiences that I talk to, I think it's really important that I distinguish between racism as a system, racism that's institutional, which really is inherently the idea of racism, that it is systemic, that it is institutional, that it is about power, and then contrast it against the adjectival form, right, of racist. And I think Ibram Kendi does this really well in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he talks about not people who are racist, but that there are racist actions and ideas and behaviors. So any one of us can be racist, and any one of us can be anti-racist. Okay, I do give a few definitions. I'm not going to go over these in detail. Again, there are hyperlinks for all of these, but it's important for people to understand that racism as a system has impacted people in the United States whether they are white or non-white. Obviously, if you are not white, you may be feeling these effects very, very acutely, have experienced it as violent harm on an ongoing basis. Because racism in the United States is about white supremacy. And again, I talk really specifically when I do these webinars about how I'm not talking about the KKK or men in white sheets. I'm talking about the ideology and the political ideas that have said from the founding and before the founding of the United States, it was better to be white, and you were enfranchised as a citizen if you were white, and a man, I should add. And if you weren't those things, you weren't considered a citizen, you weren't even considered a human being in some cases. Okay, so I then give a very brief history of anti-Asian racism. So we are seeing in our current moment a rise in anti-Asian racism against anyone who's perceived to be Chinese or can be identified as Chinese East Asian. But this anti-Asian racism, as I said before, has been around since the 19th century, since there has been a wave of Chinese laborers coming to the United States. And again, there are hyperlinks into all of the information on this slide. That anti-Asian racism led to yellow peril, the concept of yellow peril, the rhetoric that is used anytime you want to deem Asians as a foreign threatening presence. So all of the language we're seeing emerge about China as a threat, and blaming China for the coronavirus is absolutely in keeping with yellow peril rhetoric, which deems Asians to be diseased, foreign, a danger to the body politic. And again, we're seeing all of that kind of come to a head in our current pandemic moment. The problem among many of racism is that it flattens out ethnic differences. In the case of Asian Americans, what it does is it allows for a kind of misidentification and a kind of broad application and broad stereotyping of anyone who's perceived to be of that group. So in the specific case of East Asians, one example that we can see, I am sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. This slide talks about Asians becoming American. I'm going to fast forward to what I was just talking about. Okay, Vincent Chen. So in the 1980s in Detroit, Vincent Chen was a civil engineer. There was a Detroit auto industry slump. People were blaming Japan, and hence people who are Japanese. Vincent Chen was misidentified as Japanese. He happened to be Chinese American. Let me be really clear. It doesn't make a difference, right? If Vincent Chen had turned out to be Japanese American, his brutal murder at the hands of two white men would still be racist and wrong. But again, this is one of the things that racism does. It doesn't ask whether Vincent Chen is actually Japanese American or not. It only somehow identifies him as this Asian foreign threat. And we can see the same thing happen after 9/11, where Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, but also South Asian, Sikh, Hindu people were all being caught up in a violent 9/11 backlash. So why is saying Chinese virus racist? So the first thing is, and again, I know I don't need to say this to all of you, it has an official name. And the World Health Organization was very intentional in 2016 by saying that they would no longer attach diseases to ethnicities or geographic regions, because they saw the kind of stigmatization, a stigmatization that sometimes was even more harmful than the disease itself. So they very intentionally named this COVID-19 instead of saying Wuhan virus or Chinese virus. And the second thing, of course, is that this is all linked to this yellow peril rhetoric, that the repetition of Chinese virus, and I'm just going to be very direct because I think that we don't have time for subtlety. This current administration, this GOP Republican administration, is definitely playing off of yellow peril rhetoric fears. It's definitely looking for a scapegoat to our current pandemic crisis, to our current economic situation. And China seems like a good place to blame for the coronavirus. And subsequently, what's happening is people are not just blaming China, they're blaming Chinese people or anyone who's perceived to be Chinese or Chinese American. Quite frankly, I don't think that the people who are carrying out these racist attacks really care all that much. They are placing their blame and their frustration and scapegoating and harming people based on their racism. And the rhetoric of saying Chinese virus adds to this. It is not innocuous. It is not innocent. So there has been an exponential rise in anti-Asian racism since the start of the pandemic in the United States and the globe. Now, the incidences that I'm most familiar with are happening in the United States. So there was a family of 4 that was stabbed in Texas. There was a woman in Brooklyn who had acid thrown in her face. There have been women in San Francisco. And again, I think this is very intersectional, right? That not all, but some of these attacks, many of these attacks are happening against women. There was a woman who was kicked and her dog was kicked. There's a Korean international student in New York City who was punched in the face. Most recently, there was an elderly Chinese American woman who was 85 years old. 2 white men tried to burn her to death. I think it's only a matter of time before we see our first fatality happen because of the violence of the anti-Asian racism. My organization came out with a statement in early March, kind of warning about anti-Asian harassment and COVID-19. Now, I want to skip to a slide I inserted after summer of 2020, and that's about the murder of George Floyd and the national and global protests against anti-Black racism. I think all of us, again, understand all too well the very long history of anti-Black racism that has been happening in the United States and why we need to say loudly and clearly that Black Lives Matter. The small list of names here are really a fraction of the people who have been victimized and harmed in very violent ways, both epistemically and physically, by anti-Black racism. The connections between anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism are through white supremacy. It's because both anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism are predicated on not being white, right? Both Asian Americans and Black Americans are not white. And because of their non-whiteness, they are deemed not citizens, not human. And there are multiple examples throughout history to show the dehumanizing effects of white supremacy as an ideology in the lived realities of non-white people. Again, my organization came out with a solidarity statement. We are a social justice organization and felt that it was very important to really show where our allegiances lie and where our commitment to educating about anti-racism also lies. And so this is the second to last slide, and then I can turn this over to questions. So I thought it was also really important in creating this slide deck to say that I'm loading a lot of information on people, and I'm talking about a lot of violence and things that are very disturbing, but there is a solution, and that solution is in anti-racism work. And as I mentioned before, any one of us can be an anti-racism ally and educator. So there is a difference between not being racist and being anti-racist. Not being racist simply means you're a decent human being and you're not doing and saying terrible things. Being an anti-racism ally and educator means that you're making a conscious decision to be just that, to educate yourself about the history of race and racism in the United States, and then to talk and act as an anti-racism ally and educator, which means calling out things like when people say Chinese virus, being an active bystander to instances of discrimination or other types of intersectional oppression. This isn't easy work, and if there's anyone who's listening who's kind of intimidated about this, it's completely understandable. If you haven't been really reading about and learning about the history of race and racism in the United States, it can feel overwhelming. And then it can feel overwhelming to talk about it, because the truth is we're going to make mistakes when talking about race and racism. So even though I've studied critical race theory, Asian American studies, ethnic studies, race and racism change constantly. There's different terminology that comes out, there's different tragedies that happen, and there's no real consensus on any one thing, right? So it's not like I can come to you, even though I'm president of the Association for Asian American Studies, and tell you that every single Asian American thinks like I do or prefers to use the terms that I do. I can only tell you what I am both experiencing as a self-identified Asian American and somebody who has studied Asian American people, lives, cultures, and narratives. So I think one of the things we have to get used to is thinking of this as a muscle. And if you've never exercised this particular muscle before, it's going to be painful. But like with exercise, you will get stronger. It'll become easier. It'll become more natural. And I definitely think that it is vital now more than ever for us to be exercising our anti-racism muscles. There is no modern social movement that has survived and been successful when it's only been the people impacted who have fought for their civil rights and their human rights. And so the last thing I'll leave you with on my slide deck is there is a list of further reading. This is really just a drop in the sea of information that is out there about race and racism in the United States, and about anti-Asian racism, and about anti-Black racism, and the things that you can do to be an anti-racism ally and educator. If you've, again, never read a single work about ethnic studies or critical race theory, highly recommend the very first book on this list by Carol Anderson, because it really talks about the deep history of anti-Black racism and white supremacy in the US. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd be happy to take questions or to have people comment.